Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session on the epistemology of harm reduction. Just quick hands up, how many people Googled that? Yeah, I'm not that clever. These people are, which is good. We've got three great speakers for you today. We've got Allie, Mikolanis, Levinson, Niño, and Tuari from New Zealand. I'll introduce each of them beforehand, so we're going to start off with Allie. So I've got notes. So Allie Mikolanis recently returned from a year-long immersion in community-led harm reduction programs around the world through the Thomas J. Watson Fellowship. Their fellowship project inspired by their work in founding a harm reduction organisation at Wesley College, where they studied sociology and critically researched drug court programs.
Hi, everyone. So yes, my name is Allie. I currently work at DPA, coordinating the Reform Conference, but I'm here at HRI to share what I learned through a year-long fellowship project on international harm reduction. And one big major theme that I left last year with is just how contested harm reduction is as a term, from grassroots survival strategies and community-led mutual aid to medical practices brought more in nonprofit and medical spaces. And in this presentation, I'll be really challenging the one-size-fits-all concept of harm reduction. So I was able to travel through the Watson Fellowship, and I explored what harm reduction looks like across different cultural contexts. And with a personal background in drug user-led organizing, I was most curious about how other communities of people who use drugs practice mutual aid and community care in diverse political and cultural climates. So I had the opportunity to immerse myself in peer-led harm reduction organizations across the 6 continents. I was with Vancouver Area Network of Drug Users, VANDU, and so-called Vancouver, Edule in Sao Paulo, Harm Reduction Victoria in so-called Melbourne, Australia, I Do Care in Cebu City, the Philippines, I Do Net in Jakarta, Hasnuna in Tangier, Metzaneres in Barcelona, Cosmic Care in Lisbon, and then I ended in Munich for the UN AIDS conference. And I also had the opportunity to connect with different local organizations connected in intersecting liberatory movements like housing occupations in Sao Paulo, local Palestinian liberation movements in every location, and psychiatry abolition groups in so-called Melbourne. But I also quickly realized just how deeply malleable the framing of my project even was. Because who counts as a peer, and what harms are we reducing, and how, and who gets to decide what those harms are? Some non-mutually exclusive conceptions of peer, people who use drugs, people who use criminalized drugs, street-based people who use drugs, if you use drugs in festival settings, if you're dependent. And so, yeah, who are we in community with, and who are our programs for? And then some non-mutually exclusive conceptions of harm reduction I ran across were health strategies, so ways to reduce bloodborne virus transmission and overdose, advocacy for drug policy reform, political action and community organizing, and just general connection to community and social wellness. And something that really resonated with me was how organizations define their work will be just as diverse as the people creating and implementing these projects to serve their communities. And the following 4 case studies highlight how different implementations of peer-led harm reduction share how people who use drugs around the world navigate their unique political, cultural, and social context to meet their community's needs. So I was able to spend 3 months on Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh territory, which is the unceded territory of the Coast Salish people who are disproportionately criminalized and let to die by the toxic drug supply. Harm reduction in the so-called Vancouver started as a grassroots approach to limiting HIV and AIDS transmission in the 1980s, and then was since brought into the city's nonprofit industrial complex with some very scaled-up nonprofits following the devastating and ongoing overdose crisis. And having these scaled-up services has saved countless of lives, but also came at the cost of deep professionalization, where harm reduction became just another line in a job description rather than a community-wide imperative to care for each other. Hierarchical, where provider and client dynamics were cemented rather than just having relationships between equals in a community. And also, harm reduction has become deeply apolitical, where organizations are often silent about street sweeps, which disrupt and displace the lives of their clients, rather than having these services grounded in the political needs of their community members. And something that I learned from the organizers in Vancouver and from their experiences and their context in this space is how for them that true social change cannot be delivered through nonprofit services. And like in the words of Insight, when talking about the nonprofit industrial complex, the revolution will not be funded. And that's where organizations like VANDU, Coalition of Peers Dismantling the Drug War, and the Drug User Liberation Front come in, where they're resisting harm reduction's co-optation by uplifting peers as those who are most impacted by the war on drugs, delivering harm reduction services through a politicized lens of drug user liberation, and engaging in cross-movement and intersectional activism. In Vancouver, the organizers at VANDU explained how harm reduction's shortcomings are in its name and how it reduces rather than eliminates harm. It keeps our community alive, which is critical and life-affirming, but we need to move forward so that we can further organize for carceral abolition, indigenous sovereignty, and an end to economic exploitation. This kind of philosophy underlies the drug user liberation movement, which expands the focus from just immediate mere survival to collective liberation and anti-imperialist struggle. This calls back to Audre Lorde's analysis that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't lead single issue lives. So because our experiences are connected in how we experience racial capitalism and imperialism, our struggles must also be connected and reflect that. And a different approach to harm reduction that I got to immerse myself in was in NARM, which is the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, and Bunurong territory, which belong to the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land. I want to pay respect to their elders past, present, and emerging, and one key form of respect is challenging Australia's colonial racist war on drugs. And I really admire Harm Reduction Victoria, the organization that hosted me, for their work on this front. Harm reduction in Australia came about in the 1990s as a grassroots response to the HIV crisis, and their government pretty quickly recognized community expertise and actually funded a drug user-led organization in every single state. Like honestly, coming from the US, like that was crazy to me to think about, that every single state in this country has a drug user-led organization funded by the government where people are out about their living experiences. But this also means that people who are out about their living experiences with drug use are expected to sit in weekly meetings with cops and abstinence-only treatment providers, and they're incentivized to self-disclose to access positions to influence policy and services, but at the same time are tokenized, stigmatized, ignored, despite their expertise. At Harm Reduction Victoria, their peers subversively operate in these public health systems to advocate for their community. And this has really paid off. They've recently had the ability to expand and grow drug checking in Victoria and in Australia for like the first time at this scale, and are about to have like a fixed drop-in center too for drug checking. So that's honestly really incredible, and is proof how insurgent inside system work can be when it is led and controlled by the communities that are most impacted. I then loved my time in Sao Paulo, which is also home to the Guarani Indigenous People and of communities impacted by neocolonialism perpetrated by the US. In Sao Paulo is home to Cracolândia, which is an open-air drug market that is home to street-based drug users, police brutality, and regular displacement and movement. But it is also home to a park of beautiful repurposed shipping containers that house vibrant community organizations that work with the people who live in Cracolândia and fight against the police brutality against their community every day. One of these organizations is Edulay, which provide education, resources, and advocacy, and a community space for people who use drugs in Sao Paulo. And it's also home to organizations like Teatro, which is a forum for people who live in Cracolândia to share their narratives and experiences with police brutality and stigma creatively. And then also Tem Sentimento, which is like a fashion collective for women and gender non-conforming folks to creatively express themselves and also have like economic independence through what they create. Community members in Brazil describe their projects as serving people who use drugs as reflective of Brazilian culture, meaning that they are people-oriented, creative, and inclusive. And while like these programs are not as medicalized as most other places, the main struggles facing Cracolândia and the people who use drugs there is the stigma and the lack of community connection and the ongoing state abandonment and state violence that they experience. So they prioritize community connection and social wellness in this context. Also welcoming people who are queer, racialized, street-based, and sex workers who aren't necessarily people who use drugs, and anyone who wants to be part of these communities can be. Recognizing the intersections and creating room for people to build solidarity and understand like the ways that state violence impacts their lives in similar ways, even if they may not have the exact same identities. And I also spent some time in Cebu City, the Philippines, which is home to the Badjao and Cebuano people. And funding and support for the war on drugs in the Philippines from the US remains an ongoing form of neocolonialism today. But I might be biased, but pure harm reductionists, in my opinion, are like unequivocally brave. Like using your own personal experiences and your stories to advocate for your community vulnerably in frequently stigmatizing and criminalizing environments is just incredible. And in the Philippines, this is even more so, where tens of thousands of civilians have been murdered in the country's bloody war on drugs, which is, although like officially declared over, the extrajudicial killings have not stopped. Pure harm reductionists jeopardize their lives to advocate for their community every day. And that's what they do at I Do Care, which offer health services, community space, and drug policy advocacy across the Philippines, but is focused in Cebu City. And these services are, again, critical and life-affirming care, but they are still defined in scope and in success by international funders, not community members. And in an era where international funding seems a little bit up in the air, it's still important to remember that communities need to have the autonomy to define what success looks like and what their community needs, and not have that externally imposed, being another form of colonialism. Peer-led harm reduction organizations deserve reliable and sustainable funding that grants them the autonomy to decide what harm reduction looks like and how to measure program success based on what matters to their communities. They need funding for these services, but they also need funding for advocacy and need the autonomy to be able to decide what it is they need and what it means to have like a successful, beneficial program in their communities. So at the end of the day, like thinking back to what Sam said at the beginning, at the end of the plenary on harm reduction is love. Like yes, harm reduction is absolutely love, and that love is manifested in like a whole diverse way through different projects and through different communities based on what context they are in. And communities of people who use drugs around the world innovate these programs to help their loved ones survive and help themselves survive, and to challenge the structures that abandon them. This peer-led harm reduction work embodies how people who experience intertwined criminalization, coercion, isolation, stigma, and trauma come together and build new realities to protect ourselves and our community members. Peer-led harm reduction represents our resiliency, creativity, and purpose, as well as those of our loved ones. And our work is critical in unraveling the war on drugs, but we can't afford to isolate ourselves as a movement. In each of my host communities, I was struck by how drug criminalization was used to manufacture threats and demonize racialized and/or class individuals who may or may not use drugs. Drug criminalization and the war on drugs was used to justify displacement and containment of quote-unquote undesirable populations as a means to expand social control and create opportunities for real estate profiteering and gentrification. The war on drugs has been used to strip people of bodily autonomy and subject them to carceral control and coercion. And these experiences endured by people who use drugs do not exist in a vacuum, and they are often shared by racialized, colonized, unhoused, and queer folks. So together, we must cultivate networks of care to challenge systems of power that perpetuate the international war on drugs and intersecting racial, economic, and gender oppression. If we are committed to ending the war on drugs, we must also commit to ending imperialism and all of its mechanisms of displacement and dehumanization. And peer-led harm reduction is an excellent place to start. Thank you.
That was excellent. We're now going to have Levinson. Levinson is a Colombian researcher, activist, and analyst specializing in drug policy and harm reduction through a critical medical anthropology lens, with extensive experience in ethnographic research and advocacy. He has collaborated with NGOs and community-based organizations on harm reduction, HIV, intercultural health systems in Colombia, emphasizing community-driven research and policy development.
Thank you. Honoring the decolonization perspective that I'm going to picture in this presentation, I would like to make the presentation in Spanish, but I think that you can follow the slides and you can get the idea what I'm talking about, but of course we can talk later after finishing the presentation. So, bueno, Muchas gracias, es un gusto estar aquí, un privilegio estar ante todos ustedes. Primero quiero hacer un disclaimer. Yo vengo a hacer esta presentación más actuando como puente, como facilitador entre formas de conocimiento diferentes. Yo no vengo de comunidades indígenas, vengo de un contexto urbano, quizás de una familia con un origen campesino, y mi idea aquí no es usurpar las filosofías que las comunidades indígenas tienen, ni mucho menos quitar su espacio de representación. Simplemente como reconociendo los grandes aportes que estas perspectivas nos pueden brindar, vengo a ponerlas en consideración para que repensemos la reducción de daños y la política de drogas que hemos realizado en nuestro país. Entonces, de nuevo, mi rol aquí es más de facilitador entre formas de conocimiento diferentes que vale la pena considerar para entrar en discusión. Entonces, esta presentación se basa en una crítica a la reducción de daños y cómo las perspectivas indígenas y el pensamiento crítico latinoamericano pueden fortalecer no solo la filosofía de la reducción de daños, sino la práctica. En ese sentido, es importante primero entender el contexto en el cual estamos desarrollando la reducción de daños, y ese es el contexto de la guerra contra las drogas, ¿no? La literatura sobre la guerra contra las drogas es abundante, entonces no voy a ahondar mucho en estos aspectos, pero quiero resaltar algunos elementos principales que ya muchos autores han trabajado, ¿no? Entonces, lo primero, la guerra contra las drogas no es una guerra contra las drogas, es una guerra contra las personas que usamos drogas, las personas que cultivan o que han sido afectadas por esta guerra, ¿no? La guerra contra las drogas tiene unos fundamentos en el racismo, en el colonialismo y en el control social de poblaciones vulnerables, racializadas, que es importante reconocer, ¿no? Asimismo, la guerra contra las drogas es una guerra contra la naturaleza, ¿no? Porque pues, hay una pregunta que uno se puede hacer y es ¿cómo es posible que una planta sea ilegal? ¿No? Eso, digamos, no tiene ningún sentido. Asimismo, es una guerra en la diversidad, ¿no? Y es una guerra también en distintas formas de ser y estar en el mundo, en distintas formas de conocer y experimentar el mundo, ¿no? Porque se nos impone la guerra contra las drogas como una única narrativa, una única posibilidad. Y aquí me centro en el concepto de un antropólogo que se llama Jared Sigon, que él habla de que la guerra contra las drogas es una forma de gobernanza en la cual los seres humanos nos estamos relacionando entre nosotros y con la naturaleza bajo unos principios de violencia y de exclusión, ¿no? Que se manifiestan de maneras diferentes, como control biopolítico, control de comportamientos, militarización de la vida cotidiana y también haciendo parte de una geopolítica del poder en la cual algunos países dictan lo que otros deben hacer, ¿no? Entonces, lo que yo vengo a exponer acá es cómo estas perspectivas de Latinoamérica y las comunidades indígenas pueden ayudarnos a pensar en nuevas formas de gobernanza, nuevas formas de crear conexiones entre nosotros y con las sustancias psicoactivas. Digamos que yo parto de una pregunta antropológica amplia, ¿no? Hay muchos conceptos que se han venido usando: legalización, regulación, despenalización, pero yo considero que deberíamos partir de una pregunta antropológica amplia, ¿no? ¿Cuál es el tipo de relaciones que queremos cultivar entre nosotros, entre seres humanos, entre comunidades, y entre nosotros con las drogas? Entendiendo que las drogas no son simplemente sustancias, las drogas son plantas, animales, hongos, representan ecosistemas, representan tecnologías y representan formas de conocimiento y formas de vida que están ligadas a esas sustancias. Entonces considero que un cambio radical en la política de drogas y en la reducción de daños debe apuntar a crear nuevas relaciones que, bajo una nueva forma de gobernanza que no se centre en la violencia y la exclusión, ayude a desmantelar las estructuras de poder que están creando el daño, ¿no? Entonces, Buen Vivir, que es el compilado de una serie de epistemologías indígenas y prácticas en las cuales se prioriza la armonía con la naturaleza, el bienestar colectivo y los derechos colectivos por encima del desarrollo económico. Digamos que el buen vivir es la manera en la que se ha conceptualizado esto, porque las epistemologías indígenas son diversas. Encontramos perspectivas indígenas de los Andes, como el Sumak Kausai, el Ubuntu africano, y otras perspectivas de otros lugares que comparten ese fundamento de que debemos tener una conexión más directa entre nosotros y con la naturaleza, que no se base en sistemas de opresión y de exclusión. Entonces, ¿cuáles son los principales elementos, digamos, epistemológicos que nos ofrece el buen vivir? Lo primero es lo que se llama una ontología relacional, ¿no? Nosotros somos seres humanos, las sustancias son sustancias, pero no quiere decir que somos entes aislados. Nos hemos co-construido a lo largo de la historia, ¿no? Los seres humanos hemos venido usando sustancias psicoactivas desde el principio de la humanidad y hemos construido relaciones, ¿no? Con distintos efectos, unos más positivos, otros más negativos. Entonces, lo que esta perspectiva de buen vivir permite es entender que estamos interconectados, que esta separación entre humanos y naturaleza es una dicotomía falsa. Asimismo, otro fundamento del buen vivir es el desmantelamiento de las perspectivas epistemológicas que hemos heredado de Occidente, de la modernidad, en las cuales siempre se nos encasilla la realidad dividida en pequeñas cápsulas, ¿no? Entonces creamos divisiones entre cultura y naturaleza, mente y cuerpo, sujetos y objetos, individuos versus comunidades, racionalidad en contra de la emoción, ¿no? Entonces el buen vivir nos invita a pensar que estas dicotomías son falsas, que las cosas son más interconectadas de lo que pensamos, y que esas divisiones esquemáticas es lo que nos ha producido bastante daño. Asimismo, otro principio importante es la reciprocidad, ¿no? Es la idea de que tenemos que crear nuevas formas de gobernanza teniendo relaciones recíprocas, no simplemente transaccionales y utilitarias. Y en ese sentido, pues el buen vivir se ha opuesto al epistemicidio, ¿no? Que es al desconocimiento de que hay otras formas de conocer y estar en el mundo, que no son científicas necesariamente o que no hacen parte de la tradición filosófica occidental, sino que tienen otras concepciones y que no por eso no son válidas, ¿no? Asimismo, pues, el buen vivir ha criticado como esta perspectiva del desarrollo económico como la única realidad posible para pensar políticas, intervenciones y desarrollos en países y a nivel global. Está repetida, gracias. Entonces, ¿cómo se articula esto con el buen vivir, ¿no? Entonces, digamos, hay muchas críticas que se han hecho a la reducción de daños a lo largo de los años, y yo sé que aquí estamos personas que hemos hecho cosas diferentes, estamos haciendo cosas diferentes, y me quiero enfocar a esas formas de reducción de daños que se han institucionalizado, que a veces han sido cooptadas por los gobiernos y que les han despojado de ese carácter político, ¿no? Como esa reducción de daños que se domestica. Y esa reducción de daños presenta varios problemas, ¿no? El primero es que la reducción de daños sigue teniendo un foco en los individuos, ¿no? Priorizando el comportamiento individual como el eje principal de trabajo. Y si bien esto es importante, es también reconocer que estos individuos hacen parte de comunidades, ¿no? de un universo complejo en el que los individuos nos relacionamos con otros y nos relacionamos con las sustancias de distintas maneras. Entonces es también importante considerar no solo el aspecto individual, sino colectivo en el cual esos individuos están inmersos. Adicionalmente, el otro problema con la reducción de daños es que su narrativa y su práctica se ha centrado en una perspectiva científica y específicamente biomédica, es decir, seguimos centrándonos en los daños relacionados con el uso directo de las sustancias, ¿no? En una perspectiva biomédica de comprender la salud como un aspecto netamente biológico, en entender el uso de drogas desde una perspectiva farmacológica que es muy reduccionista, porque si bien es importante resolver los daños que la gente tiene con el uso directo de sustancias, proveerles de parafernalia y otro tipo de cosas para que no afecten su salud, es también importante entender que nuestros cerebros, nuestros neurotransmisores no están en un vacío. Estamos en un contexto sociocultural, en un momento histórico determinado que nos hace actuar de maneras particulares. Y esto también ha llevado a que la perspectiva dominante de la reducción de daños, al centrarse en la biomedicina, tome el conocimiento científico como su fuente principal de conocimiento, dejando de lado otras alternativas que pueden ser válidas, que no necesariamente son académicas, no son escolarizadas, no están articuladas a las credenciales de los sistemas educativos, pero que son muy válidas y que aún perviven en nuestros territorios. En ese sentido, pues, la reducción de daños también, es importante que la reducción de daños no se centre solo en los daños directos causados por el uso de drogas y por las políticas, sino justamente que la reducción de daños apunte a destruir las estructuras de poder que están creando el daño, ¿no? De otra manera se convierte en algo paliativo, ¿no? Como en ponerle una cura a un problema grande. Y si la reducción de daños no trasciende eso, pues simplemente estamos dándole continuidad a los sistemas de opresión en los que estamos. Entonces hay que jugar en ambas bandas, hay que ayudar a la gente a que no tenga los daños directos, pero también a deconstruir esos sistemas de poder. Y esto tiene que ver un poco con la despoliticización de la reducción de daños, en los cuales cuando se piensa netamente como una intervención técnica, pues pierde esos horizontes políticos y de transformación que muchas veces queremos, ¿no? Y por último, y muy importante, es claro que la reducción de daños pues se centra en personas, pero la reducción de daños también afecta a los no humanos, a la naturaleza, a los contextos en los que nos desenvolvemos. Entonces, por ejemplo, hay una cosa muy importante que ha pasado en algunos países del mundo, se ha regularizado el uso de cannabis, por ejemplo, en respeto de derechos humanos y libertades individuales. Sin embargo, esa regulación también crea problemas en el sentido que, bueno, ¿qué pasa con todos estos baterías, vaporizadores, plástico que estamos produciendo? ¿Qué pasa con el impacto en la producción de energía del cultivo indoor, por ejemplo? Entonces, hay muchas cosas que tenemos que seguir considerando trascendiendo esa perspectiva netamente humana. Entonces, por último, pues ya cerrando, pues esto fue como un brochazo rápido de lo que podemos aprovechar de estas perspectivas del pensamiento crítico latinoamericano y del buen vivir. La invitación es aquí, es hacer una reflexión a la reducción de daños que estamos realizando, y para hacer una reflexión crítica podemos hacernos varias preguntas, y es, ¿a quién estamos atendiendo con la reducción de daños, ¿no? ¿Quién está quedando excluido, ¿no? Porque hay veces la financiación, las maneras en las que se estructuran los proyectos apoyan a unas poblaciones más que a otras. Asimismo, también pues, la reducción de daños puede convertirse en una forma de control social, entonces hay que entender también cómo qué formas emergen y apuntar a una reducción de daños que más que disciplinar personas que usan drogas, apunte a que las personas se liberen de los sistemas de opresión, ¿no? Y en ese sentido también es importante reconocer dónde está la resistencia, dónde están los focos de trabajo que pueda hacer la reducción de daños. Entonces, esto es una invitación a que nos pensemos de manera colectiva y diversa, con otras formas de conocimiento, con otras formas de vida, en repensar las políticas de drogas y la reducción de daños, porque lo que la prohibición quiere es imponernos una única realidad en la cual la violencia es la base de la política, en la cual la exclusión es la base del relacionamiento y en la cual la sobriedad es el único camino, ¿no? Y esto pues yo lo llamo es como la dictadura de una única realidad que debemos desafiar mediante el trabajo colectivo y diverso, ¿no? Entonces, la invitación es que si bien no necesariamente desde la reducción de daños vamos a transformar el mundo, sí es importante que nos conectemos con otras causas, con derechos laborales, con derecho a la salud, con el derecho a la tierra de muchas poblaciones, y pues seguir trabajando en esto. Entonces, no sé cómo van a ser los resultados de toda esta mezcla de perspectivas, lo único que yo tengo por claro es que el cambio tiene que ser colectivo. Muchas gracias.
And finally we have Tuari Potiki. He's the chair of the New Zealand Drug Foundation and chair of the National Indigenous Drug Centre in New Zealand.
I need my glasses. I've got a video. How do I play the video? Oh, good. Got it. Thank you. Kia ora. Nō reira tuatahi me mihi atu kia te haukanga no konei miki. Nō rātou manaki mātou, i tēnei wā, he mihi anō tēnei atu kia koutou kua tai mai ki te whakahonore mātou nei nō reira tēnā rā koutou. So kia ora, just firstly acknowledging the local people from here, the Indigenous people who have welcomed us and on whose land we all stand. And secondly, acknowledging all of you who have come along and who are honouring us by your presence. So hello, kia ora. My name is indeed Tuari Potiki, from Tuaponimi, the South Island of New Zealand. I am chair of the New Zealand Drug Foundation currently and our National Māori Addiction Centre. But prior to that, I had a lived experience. I was an intravenous drug user for many, many years. One of the very few who managed to get off it for a while, but unbeknownst to me at the time, I'd contracted Hep C, and that rumbled along for quite a while. And then in 2017, it turned into liver cancer. So I had to have a chunk of my liver cut off. And so been involved with alcohol and drugs in different ways for a number of years, more recently in sort of governance roles. So look, I really want to talk about a couple of things. One is, and it's going to be kind of speed dating because I'm going to race through some of this stuff a bit, but I want to just let you know how we developed some harm reduction principles for Aotearoa New Zealand that are underpinned, in fact modelled on, and are Māori Indigenous values, Māori values. And at the end I want to show a very brief video as an example of an Indigenous, a Māori resource that we developed to combat stigma. So hopefully that's what will happen. So and one of the sort of bylines of this talk was that that Indigenous people invented harm reduction. And as you'll see here, back home in Aotearoa, amongst our tribes, we have a number of practices that are you could call harm reduction. And although, of course, harm reduction in this forum and in this way isn't an Indigenous thing, and has not been at the forefront of the way that we've gone about doing things at home as Māori, we do have practices and ways of doing things that are our own Indigenous harm reduction, and some of those are on the right. A thing we call rāhui. A rāhui is it's a device for separating tapu things, so commonly deployed to protect natural resources and people. An example is if someone drowns in the sea, then the local tribe will often put a rāhui on that part of the ocean where that person has drowned and stop people taking kaimoana seafood or anything for a period of time until, in our belief, the spiritual parts of that have been cleansed. So that's a rāhui. We have karakia, which are incantations, chants, prayers you could call them, but that's kind of a slightly different concept. But they are designed to make us safe and make our ritual activities, our tikanga, safe. We have our learned people, our tohunga. They are our experts in different fields, and it could be anything. It could be our language, fishing, health and well-being, anything. We have tohunga weaving, a whole bunch of things. Often chosen by the tribe as being a leader in a particular area, and they guide us in ensuring that our customs are protected and observed, and that we are protected from spiritual forces or spiritual harm. We have our families, our whānau, and our sub-tribes, who are also sort of, our whānau structures are also protective, and are designed to ensure that we support one another. And then we have our values that underpin all of that, one of which is manaakitanga, which I'll talk a bit more about soon. And it's the process of showing respect and generosity and care for each other and how we go about doing that. And then we also have a word called mauri, which is it's basically the essential life force that we all have, and all other things have as well. It's not just human beings who have a mauri. So we have these ancient practices that have been used for many, many centuries to keep us safe from physical and spiritual harm. In the 1960s, because of the introduction of alcohol through this settlement of our country, one of our chiefs up in the middle of the North Island, Reimagining, he saw that alcohol was already causing huge problems amongst our population, amongst our Indigenous population. And people had stopped listening to him, and they'd stopped doing those things that were keeping them safe and looking after each other. And he had a bit of a problem with that. So he declared a rahui, which I talked about before, on alcohol within the tribal region. So he said, we don't want alcohol in here. We don't want our people using it. We just don't want it. So he by that time, though, of course, colonisation was happening, and we'd started to lose quite a bit of our own autonomy and authority. But that was an Indigenous response. He said, that's enough. And then he created these roles, people called watani, or wardens, who were there to look to enforce it. So they went around and made sure that they stopped alcohol coming in, and they made sure that our people weren't indulging in alcohol. 80 years later, I think, the government kind of acknowledged that we were doing this by making it a law. And we now have over 900 Māori wardens throughout the country, still mainly focused on alcohol, and they have powers under an Act of Parliament that specifically relate to alcohol, so they can go in and, or they did, and get Māori people to leave hotels and take the car keys off them and do things. So they were, for quite a long time, there's been this more sort of contemporary approach to reducing alcohol harm anyway amongst our populations. We have in Aotearoa a new term for harm reduction. We need to acknowledge that it's a gift from one of our tohunga, one of our esteemed leaders, a man called Keri Opai. And the Māori name, and I'll explain it to you, is whakaiti pa mamai kai whakapiri. Whakaiti means literally to make small. Iti is small, whaka is to move towards. So whakaiti means to make small. It's also the word we have for, it's like if you're too big-headed, whakahihi. Our elders will often say, me whakaiti koe, like just make yourself a bit smaller. Mamai is hurt or pain, and pa mamai is being touched by hurt or pain or harm. And the new word for drugs, the words are kai whakapiri. Now this is a really new concept for a lot of people to get their head around. So we used to have words for drugs in Māori, but we didn't have literal translations because we didn't have opium, we didn't have cannabis naturally growing in New Zealand, so we didn't have words for them. So they developed other words like tarukino, which really means a bad or evil thing imported from abroad. That was the sort of name for cannabis. Whakapauau, something that makes you go mad in the head. The Māori word for alcohol is waipiro. Piro means dirty or stink. Wai means water. So the Māori word for alcohol is stink water, because when it first was introduced, that's what it was, it's stink water. So when in this kaumātua, this elder of ours who went away at this tohunga and came back with the term kai whakapiri for drugs, he'd never heard of Johann Hari. He hadn't read Chasing the Scream. He knew none of that. And he took a few months to think carefully about drugs, including alcohol. And what he came back with was this term kai whakapiri, which reframes the whole use of drugs from being a negative thing to something associated instead with the human need to seek connection, which we think is pretty cool. So our new term, our new phrase for harm reduction within Aotearoa is whakiti pa mamai kai whakapiri. In 2022, the New Zealand Drug Foundation was commissioned to produce the National Harm Reduction Guidelines as a part of a group of special projects that the government were running. This is for the whole country, not just for Māori. We got a lot of Māori together, had hui. We worked with an organisation called Te Rawora, which is a Māori mental health organisation, to bring people together to develop the values that could guide harm reduction practice. And we also brought together non-Indigenous people, hundreds and hundreds of lived experience, and living experience people to also give ideas and feedback and to develop the values and then reflect on them. And we believe that this approach, is to harm reduction could be a positive example for others to use. So what they came up with was 8 values to underform harm reduction practice for everybody, not just for Māori. Some of them you'll be familiar with. Manaki, which means caring or supporting. Harm reduction puts people first. Everyone has mana. Mana is an intrinsic sort of thing that you're born with. It's hard to explain in another language, but it's spiritual, but it's from Atua, from God's initially, but it comes down through people. Everyone is entitled to be treated with respect and dignity. We meet people where they're at without coercion, judgment, or discrimination. Tika, justice, doing the right thing for the right reason. We're guided by evidence from the people we're supporting that our work is making an impact, or the intended impact. Pono, the honesty and truth. We behave with honesty and integrity. This includes knowing ourselves so we can be present with people without judgment. Aroha, love and compassion. We have absolute focus on the person, their whānau, their family, their community, respecting their mana, their autonomy, and their human rights. Mana takatahi, or autonomy. We understand and support positive changes that people want to make that minimise health, social and legal impacts of drug use without requiring them to commit to stopping or reducing their use. Ka noho matapu, confidentiality. We know our role in the relationship with the people we support, and we are clear with boundaries, including confidentiality. Kotahitanga, unity. We are connected with others who use harm reduction approaches and stand up against coercion, judgment, and discrimination, the people who use substances. And wawata, aspirations. We understand the impacts of colonisation and protect space for whānau, hapu, and iwi to set and reach their own aspirations, goals, and ideals. When we afterwards would develop these values and went back to the people lived and living experience, these were some of the comments they were making about the new values. About smashing the expert learner, doctor, patient, provider power structure, stops the stigma, would be a much safer and caring place. So we knew that we had support, a lot of support from the people who we were there to, on behalf of and talking about. And so getting that mandate and support from lived and living experience people was incredibly important, and it really validated the whole thing, to be honest. I won't read through all of them, but a couple of them in particular. One of the comments was whānau or family. If these values were implemented, then whānau or families wouldn't feel judged. And another one was tino ranga tiratanga. That's the translation of that really is self-determination, or mana motuhake. It means that we are in charge of our own lives and our own destinies. So, there were some pretty profound statements made about the values and how people believed that they would be, could be beneficial. So I just want to leave you with this, and this is a video. This is an example of one harm reduction resource that we developed for Māori. Group called Whare Tukutuku, which is a National Alcohol and Māori Alcohol and Drug Centre, which I mentioned before. Oh, have you got volume? Hang on. See if I can find it with the volume.
Te kupu. Words have power. The Indigenous people of Aotearoa experienced systemic racism and discrimination through the process of colonisation. Today, racism and discrimination is still a common feature for whānau Māori who use alcohol and other drugs, impacting their health and well-being and limiting their ability to gain access to Māori pathways for better healthcare. Racism and discrimination often emerges in the form of stigmatising language that shames and belittles, making whānau feel less important and limiting their ability to seek help. to rise above the devastating impacts of colonialism and achieve inclusive and equitable opportunities that honour te tiriti o Waitangi, we must stop using stigmatising language within Aotearoa. Māori should never be defined by race, alcohol or drug use, or any label given to them, including a diagnosis. When we apply labels, we dehumanise people. For example, calling someone an addict can make that person not want to seek help because they don't want to be labelled as an addict, or they believe being known as an addict will result in a different standard of care. Person-centred language acknowledges someone as a person before describing their personal attributes or health conditions. Reconsider how you think about your whānau and use language that focuses on them rather than their alcohol and other drug use. Don't use stigmatising language that labels, judges, or stereotypes them. For example, instead of calling or referring to someone as a druggie, say person who uses drugs. Whānau Māori who use or have used alcohol and other drugs may refer to themselves and their life experiences with stigmatising language, but that is their choice. It does not give us permission to do the same. If you continue to use stigmatising language within Aotearoa, you continue to accept the injustices of colonisation, and we must continue to fight against colonisation in all its forms. Now is the time to start using the right language to help improve the way whānau Māori who use alcohol and other drugs receive care, and to strengthen Māori health solutions that help reduce alcohol and other drug harms. Stigmatising language and racism ends with all of us.
And just one example of how we are using our own sort of values and our own way of looking at the world, including our own experience of colonisation, as a way of reaching our people, because sometimes we come in with language like words like epistemology that none of us understand, that just fly over everybody's heads. But if we can anchor what we're trying to do in things that are meaningful, like our experience of colonisation, for instance, then it seems to connect them much better. Initially for Indigenous people, but also for the rest of the country as well. So hopefully, some of you may now think about working with your Indigenous colleagues to develop up ways of working within your communities that are a combination of both Indigenous values perhaps and other values. So it doesn't have to be either or, it can be both. Kia ora.
I think there's a certain, I don't know if irony is the right word, but there's a certain something in the fact that they've chosen me to chair this, and I'm an atheist from one of the worst colonisers on the globe. And, and I'm sitting there and thinking, yeah, we've done some bad shit around the world. And, I apologise wholeheartedly for any of my ancestors that did wrong to anybody. Do we have any questions from anybody? You can show
That's so fine. I was just wondering, for the last video that we saw, are we able to find that online somewhere? Where would we be able to find that? Sorry.
Yes, and I apologise. I had a slide, but I didn't know how to find it after I played the video. It's online, and I'll spell it out because it's wharitukutuku.com. So it's WHARETUKU. Let's say it again. WHARE, whare, tukutuku, TUKU, one word, .com. And that's you go and have a look around and you'll find that there's some other resources there as well.
This is from my friend from New Zealand. What role does spirituality play in the emergence of indigenous harm reduction standards? So what role does spirituality play in the emergence of indigenous harm reduction standards?
It's everything. So all of those concepts I talked about before, rahui, tohunga, all of those things, they're all spiritual in nature, all of them. All of them. So it's everything. It's,
I asked the question because in Native American spirituality, plays a huge part right now in the emergence of indigenous North American harm reduction principles. So I was wondering if there's a connection between the two.
I think just many indigenous cultures, if not all, have very strong spiritual bases. Some are more willing to share than others. I know I've got friends from Australia who told me that initially a lot of their elders were unwilling to share their spiritual views and beliefs because they'd shared everything else and they'd been taken away. So they held on to the one thing that meant the most to them. So yeah, it's hugely important. But it's also really important to acknowledge that word spirituality in however that looks and whatever that means to them, and not put our own imposition of what we think it is on them, which is what the Bible has done in many places, unfortunately.
Hi there, I can project. It's okay.
Perfect.
Thank you so much to all of you. I really appreciate it. I'm from Toronto, Canada. I'm a settler myself, but I work really closely with a lot of Indigenous folks, and I work very closely with a lot of Indigenous organizations that are trying to integrate Indigenous culture into contact work. And one of the tensions that they have come across is through the colonial history, the influence of Christianity and recovery-based models coming into tension with harm reduction, indigenous cultural models, which are rooted really in the back spirituality, or as me and my friends see it. I'm curious how you, my friend from New Zealand, see that navigation of tension, particularly with elders that maybe won't be willing to let folks that are using drugs enter into cultural practice, for example, ways of isolating that are happening, stigmatization. As you said, the prohibition on certain parts of the land means they have to leave. We have a lot of non-alcohol reserves in Canada as well, and people are sent to the cities. I'm just curious about that.
Someone else might want to have do you want to have a go?
Well, for example, in the case of Colombia and the history of colonization here, I'm talking about psychedelics, which is a current topic right now. We have seen that at the beginning during the colonization, the use of psychedelics has been rejected. No, it has been connected at witchery because Catholic framework, the Catholic mindset, made this interpretation about this usage, and they were rejected. But now that they are interested in psychedelics because there is a lot of business around that, now they are interested in connect with indigenous communities in order to understand how they use it and how we can reframe it as a commodity. So I have seen that right now there is an interest in working with indigenous communities, but sometimes, despite well intentions, there are no a real epistemic dialogue between the interpretation that people do around these substances, because for indigenous communities, psychedelics, for example, are not psychedelics. There are not drugs, there are medicines, there are something sacred. So it's difficult to understand how these different mindsets could dialogue. And the thing is that right now, in which we are talking about the therapeutic potential of psychedelics, we are focused on scientific knowledge, and the scientific knowledge tries to use some of the indigenous knowledge, but incorporate it into a scientific hegemonic metrics, but there is no dialogue. No? They only include what they think is important, but there is no real dialogue. So I think that this is a new wave of colonization, and that's why, for example, in Colombia, like 30 years ago, the indigenous communities created a union of medicine men who used yahe, for example, because they knew that were going to happen. And right now they are trying to create the spaces to make this dialogue, to be able to talk about drug policy, but recognizing that for them this is not drugs. When they talk about substances, they are talking about their territory, their systems of knowledge, and that kind of things. And so I think that it's important to continue making these bridges and open to real dialogues. If not, we are continuing doing the same path of colonization, only by a different or more friendly perspective.
Kia ora, thank you. Yeah, true. And like one of the issues has been that a lot of our elders are very, very conservative, and they've been a lot of them are very church-based, and they bring those sort of values, and also that they've listened to the war on drug rhetoric, and they've also harm reduction has been set up almost in opposition to like abstinence. So abstinence is a good thing, harm reduction is a bad thing. So, and some of the resistance to our reframing of drugs came from the elders. He didn't like it. They're the ones who came up with those other terms, evil and nasty. In 2019, I think 19, we had a referendum on legalising cannabis in New Zealand. And we lost by 49 to 51%, it was tiny. When we looked at the stats within our indigenous population, less than 20% of Māori aged over 60 supported it. Over 80% of Māori aged under 60 supported it. So it sounds horrible, but we're waiting.
I'm going to use my chair's privilege to ask a question. As a colonising country, our indigenous people are the colonisers. Is there a way of, because the ways of working, the Maori way of doing things and other ways of doing things, they hold so much good information and so much good advice. And you've all talked about the deleting of history and deleting of cultures. Is there a way that countries outside of those cultures can use those lessons from those cultures, but not in a way that we're just raiding and stealing and pillaging them again and using them in an inappropriate way? Is there a way for us to use the lessons of people who've been doing this for hundreds of years in an appropriate way? I'll start with you because you've not answered a question yet.
So I don't know, given the fact that I am also a settler from a colonial, like the imperial core, like I do not have the best perspective on this, like just given positionality. But from what I experienced in the Philippines and the erasure of culture and community needs by funding restrictions, countries like Canada, Australia, the US, Western Europe, when providing international funding, like yes, this money is good, but like provide money in a way that allows the communities to choose what it is that they need, fund advocacy, fund social connection, because like oftentimes it seems like funders were looking for like numeric returns on investment when like those investments were people's lives. And like to them, like social connection in the community and the breaking down of stigma was like the most important part of their work, but that was also what remained unfunded and like unrecognized by like measures of success. And like that being a form of neocolonialization, from like the US and like these international funders, like giving money without these ties, which is like a hard sell to like these funders that operate like businesses. And so like the root of our economic system is just like screwed. But yeah, that was a hopeful thought, sorry.
One of the sayings that the harm reduction movement has is that the only real harm reduction is being anti-capitalist. And in that sense, everything we can do to reframe our current perspective about the world, to reframe this perspective, focus on economic growth, could be important in that way. So in that perspective, I consider that listening to the indigenous communities and other vulnerable populations that have been affected by war on drugs is important, but it's not only listening to them, but to create the space, facilitate the spaces to have these conversations. Because it's not only the political will, but it's important to recognize that there are material, economical, historical conditions that affects that we can have these dialogues with these communities. And right now, as Allie mentioned, there is a problem with funding. For example, and for one community, harm could be something like about land tenure, you know, but there are not grants given for that. Now the harm reduction grants are focused on how many syringes are you going to give for people during a certain period of time. But for communities, they have to measure other things that are important, and these disconnections affects how the people could transform their realities. So I think that this is the most important thing, that even when you have a good disposition, a good will to help, it's important that you can create together in a dialogue, what are the harms, what are the particularities, what are the goals of the projects you are doing about harm reduction, not to impose the categories previously.
I also have something to add that I forgot to say at the very end, but I also love staying with like communities in Indonesia, and while I was there, like a close friend was criminalized and was targeted for his activism, and the power of international solidarity like really pulled through and being able to fundraise to cover his legal fees. His name is Aga. He has started an organization called the Indonesian Network of Drug Users, IDUNET. I made a zine about his story and about like the power of like international harm reductionists coming together and recognizing like solidarity with his work and how most of us have experienced pushback for our activism and like resistance that way. And so it talks a little bit about IDUNET, talks about his story, talks about like our journey to justice for Aga, and he's now free. It's wonderful. He had to go through like coerced treatment, which is like obviously just an extension of drug criminalization, but it does mean that he is free to continue his organizing work. But yeah, so feel free to pick up a zine on your way out.
Oh, we've got another question just over here. Have you got a loud voice or do you need a mic?
Obviously is encapsulates harm reduction, but has a different kind of frame within it. And I just kind of wonder to what extent, what do we gain and what do we lose by hanging on to this term that's been around for 25 years, harm reduction? Obviously, and I'm not talking about the substance of what people are doing here, but the label, the branding. And I'm sorry if I'm poking the bear too much with some people here, but I'd be really curious to hear people's thoughts on this.
I'll start and then I'll just pass it down because I have a feeling we all have complex thoughts on this. But like also prefacing with, I love a provocative question. I love that because like I do think that harm reduction as a label for a movement like does have its faults, and like that's something that we've all touched on. I do think it encapsulates what we do, but I think it also highlights like our room for growth, and I think that like it also creates space to bridge like health justice for people who use drugs with health justice for every marginalized population, and with like changing those power structures. And so I think like the broadness of that does create a lot of space for like solidarity building and intersectional like collective liberation. But like after the problem-centered framing, like I think it's important to name our problems, but also have like a more like hopeful liberatory vision for the future, and that's where I think drug user liberation comes in as like a secondary term.
Something that is great about narratives is that the concepts are polysemic, no? So there are different interpretations of what is harm reduction, even in their philosophy and epistemology and in its practice. So what has happened in different social movements around the history is that sometimes the labels, the concept that they use have been co-opted by the dominant powers. This has happened with interculturalism, with the environmental movement. This has happened, and for example, right now we can see that even institutions such as the FMI or World Bank, they are using the concept of decolonization, but it's a domesticated interpretation of decolonization. And what we have to do is, now we are using this label of harm reduction to be together, to be as a collective, and we have different background, different experiences about harm reduction, different interpretation about the concept, and different practices. But I think that together we can retake this concept and make a new interpretation more comprehensive, you know. And maybe in the future we have to change the name. We don't want to talk more about harms. Maybe the need in the future will be another different thing. The important thing is that we are here connected because we think this so-called harm reduction, but together we have the power to redefine it. And the important thing is that we can do that from the bottom of the society, from the social movements, from our organization, from the people who use drugs, from the people who has been affected by the war on drugs. So together we can rebrand this harm reduction to something different to the domesticated concept that has been used for different governments around the world.
Yeah, cool, good question. And you're right, look, there's similar criticism at home, same reason, that you're starting off with the negative. And we all try to be strengths-based and think positively and look to the future rather than looking backwards. So, yeah, I think it's an ongoing discussion. I think, as you say, you're kind of, you know, I mihi to your courage for raising it in this environment. I think if you raised it in the big room, you'd probably have to run because it has become a movement. And it is something that people are very, very passionate, including me, very, very passionate about. And it's almost become a community, like a tribe, actually. I was thinking yesterday at the opening, I was sitting there feeling a bit emotional because I thought, you know, the difference between this group of people and everyone else out there that I interact with is that these people care about other people. There's, you know, so there is something special about the group, and I think because we are now tribally harm reductionists, it's going to be really difficult. But I don't know, maybe we've just got to try and encourage those people to understand it from a different lens, maybe, what it really means. And that it has become so much more encompassing. Human rights, you know, dignity, everything, it's who we are, really. So.
I'm going to chair's privilege again, and I'm going to say something about that one. And putting to one side whether or not harm reduction is the right words and the negativity of it, and I kind of agree, but that's a separate issue. We did a bit of research in the UK that I did around the world kind of thing, asking people about the philosophy of harm reduction. a lot of the older UK-based harm reductionists, it was about giving out needles, and that was it. And they resisted anything to do with anything else. Younger and more international people saw it as social justice, racial justice, gender justice. So, as you said, we're waiting for those old ones to fuck off. I would like everybody just to thank again our amazing speakers. We have the room, I believe, for about another 10 minutes. So there's that zine to come and grab, which I'm going to be grabbing one of as well, and the speakers will be here to answer some questions. If you've got any questions for them, come and ask personally. Thank you.